Two men slipped into a crack in the Texas hillside, snorkels on, flashlights barely cutting through the black water. And what they found on the other side had been sitting untouched since before the last ice age ended. No one had seen it. No one had even known it was there. And when the bones started turning up, they weren't just old. They were wrong. Wrong for this place, wrong for this time, wrong for everything scientists thought they knew about Central Texas. Think about that for a second. Somewhere under a quiet patch of Texas hill country, close enough to a major city that you could drive there in under an hour, there was a doorway into the deep past that nobody had ever opened. Not archaeologists, not geologists, not the landowners who walked past it for years without a second thought. It just sat there, sealed off by water and darkness, holding onto a version of Texas that no living person has ever seen. A version with saber-toothed predators stalking through forests, armored giants the size of cars grazing in open ground, and animals that modern Texans would associate with deserts half a world away. This is not a story about digging. There were no shovels, no pickaxes, no careful brushing away of dirt under a hot sun. This is a story about water, about a narrow, flooded passage cut through limestone somewhere in the hill country outside San Antonio, and about two men who swam into the dark, not entirely sure what they were going to find, and came out the other side having rewritten a small but important piece of prehistoric history. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand the ground itself. Central Texas sits on top of some of the most cave-riddled limestone in North America. Rainwater soaks into the soil, seeps down through cracks in the rock, and over hundreds of thousands of years it dissolves the stone from the inside out, carving tunnels, chambers, and long twisting corridors that snake beneath the hills like veins under skin. Most of these caves are dry, or at least dry enough to walk through with a headlamp and sturdy boots. But some of them are different. Some of them sit low enough, or connected deep enough into the water table, that they fill with groundwater and never fully drain. These are called water caves, and they behave less like static caverns and more like slow, dark rivers, hidden from the sun, flowing quietly beneath the surface for as long as anyone can imagine, carrying whatever falls into them further and further into the dark, undisturbed for a generation after generation. One of these water caves sits on private land in Comal County, not far from San Antonio. On the surface, there is nothing dramatic about it. No dramatic sinkhole, no towering rock formation, nothing that would make a passing hiker stop and stare. It looks, by most accounts, almost unremarkable. A narrow opening in the ground, easy to miss if you didn't already know it was there. Locally, it's known as Bender's Cave, and until recently, it had never been formally mapped, never been the subject of a scientific survey, and never been explored with anything more than curiosity. That fact alone says something about how much is still hiding in plain sight. This isn't some remote wilderness cave accessible only by helicopter or weeks of expedition planning. It sits on private land, within reach of a modern city, in a state where cave systems are so common that most residents barely think twice about them. And yet it took, until now, for anyone to look closely enough to realize what was sitting inside it. That's often how the biggest discoveries work, not through some dramatic, high-tech search across untouched wilderness, but through someone finally taking a second, closer look at a place everyone assumed had already given up its secrets. That changed when two researchers from the University of Texas at Austin, John Moretti and John Young, got permission to explore it. Moretti is a paleontologist, someone who has spent years thinking about the deep past written into rock and bone. Young works alongside him, and together the two of them make an unusual kind of research team. Part scientist, part caver, comfortable enough in tight, flooded spaces to do serious fieldwork in conditions that would make most people turn back at the entrance. Getting into Bender's Cave isn't like walking into a museum. There's no lobby, no gift shop, no gentle path lit by soft overhead bulbs. To get inside, you have to be willing to get wet, to squeeze through openings barely wide enough for a human body, and to trust that the air pocket ahead of you is actually there before you commit to swimming toward it. Moretti and Young went in wearing snorkels rather than full scuba gear, moving slowly through passages where the water was often just inches from the ceiling, their lights sweeping across limestone walls polished smooth by centuries of slow-moving water. What they were looking for, initially, was simply to understand the cave itself, its layout, its geology, whether it held anything of scientific interest at all. Plenty of caves in the region have been explored before and turned up little more than mud, silt, and the occasional modern animal bone washed in from the surface. There was no guarantee Bender's Cave would be any different, but almost immediately something felt off. As they moved deeper into the flooded passage, their lights began catching on shapes on the cave floor that didn't look like rock. They looked like bone, and there wasn't just one or two of them. There were dozens, scattered across sections of the submerged floor, half buried in fine sediment, sitting exactly where they had settled who knows how many thousands of years ago. In most fossil sites, discovery is slow and painstaking. Researchers map out a grid, remove soil layer by careful layer, log the exact position of every fragment before it's lifted free. It is, by nature, an act of excavation, of digging something out of the earth that has spent millennia being buried deeper and deeper. Bender's cave offered something almost the opposite, because the passage was flooded and the water had likely kept sediment from ever piling up too thickly over the bones. Many of the fossils were sitting essentially exposed, resting on the cave floor rather than locked inside it. Moretti and Young didn't need heavy tools. They needed patience, careful hands, and the ability to work underwater in a near total darkness, without disturbing a site that had remained undisturbed for tens of thousands of years. Imagine what that must have felt like in the moment. You're floating in cold, still water, in a passage barely wide enough to turn around in, your only light source, a beam cutting a few feet through the murk ahead of you. And then, resting on the floor beneath you, half covered in silt, is a curved shape that your brain slowly recognizes as bone. Not driftwood, not rock, bone. And then another, and another. That kind of moment, the slow dawning realization that you've swum into something genuinely significant, is the sort of experience most researchers spend an entire career hoping for and never actually get. Over the course of what would eventually total 6 separate trips into the cave, the two of them worked their way through the flooded passage, identifying, documenting, and carefully recovering fossils. Each trip meant suiting up, entering the same tight, water-filled opening, and spending hours, submerged in cold, still water, moving cautiously so as not to stir up the fine silt that could turn the water instantly opaque and erase visibility in seconds. It was slow, deliberate, physically demanding work, done far from the kind of controlled laboratory conditions most people imagine when they picture scientific fieldwork. And what came out of that cave, trip after trip, was extraordinary. Among the first things to catch their attention were claws, large, curved, unmistakably powerful claws that didn't belong to any animal currently living in Texas, or anywhere in North America for that matter. These belonged to a giant ground sloth, a creature that, if you saw it standing next to you today, would tower well over your head. Ground sloths were nothing like their slow-moving, tree-dwelling modern cousins. These were massive, thickly built animals, some species reaching the size of a small elephant, built low and heavy, with powerful forelimbs tipped in claws long enough to tear open logs, strip bark from trees, or defend against predators. Finding evidence of one here, buried in the sediment of a central Texas water cave, was already a significant find, but it was only the beginning. Ground sloths like this one weren't rare oddities confined to some distant corner of the continent. During the Ice Age, they ranged widely across North and South America. Some species built for climbing, others built like slow-moving bulldozers, using those massive claws to pull down branches, dig, or fend off attackers. Finding even a single set of claws, well preserved enough to identify, tells researchers something about size, diet, and behavior, and it's the kind of specimen that, on its own, would already justify a research paper. Here it was just the opening piece of a much larger puzzle. As Moretti and Young continued their careful searches, more bones and teeth began to surface. Some belonged to saber-toothed cats, the iconic predators of the Ice Age, animals built around those extraordinary elongated canine teeth, capable of delivering devastating bites to prey many times their own size. Saber-tooths are one of the most recognizable symbols of prehistoric North America, but recognizable doesn't mean common. Complete or even partial remains are relatively rare finds, and every new specimen adds meaningful detail to scientists' understanding of how these predators lived, hunted, and moved through their environment. Picture one, moving low through dense undergrowth, patient, muscular, built not for long chases, but for short, explosive bursts of power, those oversized canines designed to deliver a single decisive bite to the throat of prey many times its own size. Finding evidence of an animal like that in this particular cave means it was hunting somewhere nearby, which in turn means there was enough large prey in the area to sustain it. Another thread, connecting back to the picture of a rich, resource-heavy landscape. Then came something even less expected. The remains of a pamphithere. If that name doesn't ring a bell, that's understandable. Pamphitheres aren't part of most people's mental image of the Ice Age the way mammoths or saber-tooths are. But they should be, because these were extraordinary animals. Distant relatives of the modern armadillo, pamphitheres were covered in the same kind of bony, plated armor, but scaled up to an almost unbelievable degree. Some species grew to roughly the size of a full-grown lion, an armored, tank-like herbivore lumbering through the landscape, its back protected by overlapping bands of bone. Picture the armadillo you might see scurrying across a Texas backroad at night, and then imagine it built at 10 or 20 times the mass, and you start to get a sense of what once wandered this same region. The list kept growing. Researchers identified evidence of a giant tortoise, significantly larger than any tortoise species alive in North America today, a reptile that would have moved through the landscape at its own unhurried pace, entirely unbothered by most predators simply because of its sheer size and defensive shell. And then, almost stranger than anything else, came signs of camels and mastodons. Camels, today, are creatures most people associate with deserts far from Texas, or with zoos and postcards from the Middle East. But North America was actually home to native camel species for millions of years before they went extinct on this continent, with descendants eventually surviving only after migrating across ancient land bridges into other parts of the world. Finding camel remains here was a reminder of just how different, and in some ways, how much stranger, the landscape of Ice Age Texas actually was. Mastodons, meanwhile, were relatives of mammoths, heavily built, tusked giants that browsed on vegetation across much of prehistoric North America, and their presence here added yet another thread to the picture slowly forming inside that flooded cave. Stop and think about that combination for a moment. Saber-toothed cats stalking through the undergrowth, giant sloths pulling down branches, armored pemphitheres grazing in open ground, tortoises the size of coffee tables ambling along at their own pace, camels wandering terrain that today feels nothing like the deserts we associate them with, mastodons browsing on trees nearby. That's not a random scattering of unrelated bones. That's a functioning food web, a real ecosystem, all sharing the same patch of central Texas at the same moment in time. And every piece of it had been sitting quietly underwater, waiting, while thousands of years of later history unfolded entirely without anyone knowing it was there. Taken together, this wasn't just a handful of interesting bones. It was the outline of an entire ecosystem. Predators, giant herbivores, armored grazers, slow-moving reptiles, all existing together in the same stretch of central Texas landscape at some point deep in the past. That's the kind of find that doesn't just add a new species to a list. It reshapes the picture of what an entire environment once looked like, what animals shared space with each other, what they ate, what hunted what, and what the climate must have been like to support all of them at once. The answer lies in the way water caves form and behave over time. Bender's Cave isn't a static, sealed chamber. It's built around a narrow underground stream, a channel of water that has likely been moving through that limestone passage for an extraordinarily long time. Over the millennia, that stream has acted almost like a natural conveyor belt. Sinkholes on the surface, openings where the ground gives way into the cave system below, would periodically funnel in debris from above, soil, rock, plant material, and crucially, the remains of animals that died nearby or were swept in during flooding events. Once inside, that material would be carried along by the slow current, eventually settling into the passage where Moretti and Young would, tens of thousands of years later, find it waiting. This process explains both the richness of the site and its remarkable preservation. Because the cave stayed submerged, the bones inside it were shielded from a lot of the forces that normally destroy fossils over time. Extreme temperature swings, oxygen exposure, scavenging animals, the grinding effects of surface erosion. Water, in this case, wasn't the enemy of preservation. It was the reason so much survived in such good condition in the first place. There's a strange kind of irony in that. On dry land, exposed bone rarely lasts long in geological terms. Weather breaks it down, roots grow through it, scavengers scatter it. Acidic soil slowly eats away at it until there's nothing left to find. But drop that same bone into a quiet, oxygen-poor, temperature-stable underground stream, and the clock practically stops. The cave became less like a burial ground and more like a vault, sealed shut by water instead of stone, quietly protecting everything inside it from the forces that usually erase the past. A stretch of time roughly 100,000 years ago when the planet, in the middle of the broader ice age, went through a noticeably warmer phase. Interglacials are essentially breathing spaces within an ice age, periods when glaciers retreat, temperatures climb, and ecosystems shift dramatically in response. That detail matters enormously because almost everything scientists have previously found and studied from Ice Age, Central Texas, comes from the colder phases of that same broad era. Fossil sites tied to the last interglacial's warmer stretch are, by comparison, remarkably rare in this specific region. Despite nearly a century of active paleontological research across Central Texas, this warmer period had essentially remained a blank page, a gap in the fossil record that scientists knew existed but had never been able to fill with direct physical evidence from this particular corner of the state. Bender's Cave changes that. For the first time, researchers have a substantial, well-preserved collection of fossils that appears to date specifically to this warm interglacial window, giving them a genuine physical snapshot of what the landscape and its animal community actually looked like during a period that had previously existed mostly as an educated guess. It's the difference between having a general theory about a period of history and finally holding physical evidence that lets you test that theory against something real. And what that evidence suggests is a landscape quite different from the central Texas most people picture today. Rather than the relatively dry, scrubby hill country familiar to modern residents, the environment tens of thousands of years ago may have looked far more lush. closer to a moist, temperate forest, capable of supporting large grazing animals, giant browsers, and the predators that depended on them. Picture rolling ground covered in dense stands of trees. Instead of cedar and mesquite scrub, streams running fuller and more frequently than they do now, and enough standing vegetation to feed herds of animals that would dwarf anything roaming modern Texas ranch land. It's a version of the region that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone standing in that same spot today. That's a meaningful... It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how unusual this kind of find is. Even within a state that is famously full of caves, Texas is estimated to contain thousands of documented caves and karst features. And it draws serious attention from both recreational cavers and academic researchers, precisely because there's so much unexplored ground, quite literally, beneath people's feet. But most caves, even interesting ones, don't. It's also worth remembering that this isn't the first time a flooded cave has rewritten scientific understanding of the deep past. Divers exploring submerged cave systems in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula have previously uncovered everything from a remarkably preserved skeleton of a teenage girl who died over 13,000 years ago to sprawling underwater cave networks stretching well over 100 miles, hiding relics tied to the rise of the ancient Maya civilization. In each of these cases, the pattern is the same: water. Something genuinely different from what decades of prior work in the region had revealed. According to Moretti, if the current dating holds up under further analysis, this cave effectively opens a new window into a landscape, climate, and animal community that simply hasn't been documented before in this part of Texas. That kind of statement from a working paleontologist carries real weight. Scientists are, by training and temperament, cautious about overstating the significance of a new find. When someone in that position describes a discovery as offering something entirely new for an entire region, it's a strong signal that this isn't a minor addition to an existing catalog, but something closer to filling in a genuinely blank section of the map. There's also something worth sitting with in how this discovery happened in the first place. It wasn't the result of a massive, well-funded expedition with a dedicated excavation team and months of planning. It was two researchers, snorkels on, working through a flooded passage on private land, trip after trip, patiently documenting what they found without ever needing to break ground. In an era where a lot of scientific attention goes toward enormous, headline-grabbing projects, there's something quietly compelling about a find this significant emerging from careful, unglamorous, hands-on fieldwork in the dark. It also raises a bigger question, one that tends to follow discoveries like this wherever they happen. What else is still down there? Central Texas alone is riddled with caves that have never been formally surveyed, let alone explored with an eye toward paleontology. Some of them are dry and relatively accessible. Others, like Bender's Cave, are flooded, hidden, and require a very specific kind of effort and willingness to even attempt entry. If a single, previously unmapped water cave on private land could hold this level of scientific significance, it stands to reason that similar caves scattered across the region, the state, and honestly the world, could be holding their own undiscovered pieces of the past, quietly waiting in the dark for someone willing to swim in and look. This isn't an isolated phenomenon either. Around the world, flooded caves and underwater sites have repeatedly turned out to be some of the richest, best-preserved windows into deep prehistory, precisely because water protects what air and sunlight tend to destroy. Divers exploring submerged caves in other parts of the world have uncovered everything from ancient human remains to entire preserved ecosystems, each case reinforcing the same basic idea that some of the most important stories about our planet's past aren't buried under layers of dry soil waiting for a shovel, but submerged in darkness, waiting for someone with a light, a snorkel, and enough patience to look closely. What makes Bender's Cave stand out within that broader pattern is the sheer diversity packed into one relatively contained site. It isn't just one interesting fossil or even one interesting species, it's an entire cross-section of an ecosystem. Predator and prey, giant herbivore and armored grazer, reptile and mammal, all preserved together in a way that lets scientists start piecing together not just individual animals, but the relationships between them. That's the kind of resource that can fuel research for years, informing studies not just about these specific species, but about how ancient ecosystems responded to climate shifts, Information that carries obvious relevance for scientists studying how modern ecosystems might respond to environmental change today. Analysis of the site is still ongoing. Researchers continue working to more precisely date individual specimens, to understand the full range of species represented, and to reconstruct as detailed a picture as possible of what this particular stretch of ancient Texas actually looked like, day to day, tens of thousands of years ago. Every additional bone recovered has the potential to sharpen that picture a little further, adding detail to a landscape that, until recently, existed mostly as a gap in the scientific record. That process takes time, and it takes a level of patience that doesn't always translate well into headlines. Identifying a fossil isn't as simple as glancing at a bone and matching it to a picture in a textbook. Researchers have to compare fragments against known specimens, sometimes from collections held in museums thousands of miles away, cross-checking size, shape, and wear patterns, before they can confidently say which species they're actually looking at. Dating adds another layer of complexity entirely, often requiring specialized laboratory techniques capable of measuring the slow radioactive decay of specific elements trapped inside the bone or surrounding sediment. None of it happens quickly, and none of it happens in a single dramatic reveal. It happens slowly, one careful conclusion at a time, long after the excitement of the initial discovery has faded into the quieter, more meticulous work of actually understanding what was found. For now, what's clear is this. Somewhere beneath the hills outside San Antonio, hidden behind a narrow, unremarkable opening in the ground, water has spent roughly 100,000 years quietly preserving the remains of saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, armored pemphitheres the size of lions, giant tortoises, ancient camels, and mastodons. They sat there undisturbed through the rise and fall of countless later ecosystems, through the arrival of humans on the continent, through the entire span of recorded history, waiting in the dark until two researchers happened to slip beneath the surface and find them. It's a reminder of something easy to forget in a world that often feels fully mapped, fully documented, fully explained. There are still places, even close to major cities, even in well-studied regions, that no one has properly looked at yet. There are still stories written in bone, sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for someone curious enough, patient enough, and willing enough to get in the water and go find them. Bender's Cave was one of those places. And now that its story is finally being told, the obvious question, left hanging in the water behind it, is simple. How many more caves like this one are still out there, holding their own secrets, still waiting to be found? Maybe the next one is somewhere in the same stretch of hill country, a few miles down the road from Bender's Cave, sitting behind another unremarkable crack in the limestone. Maybe it's on the other side of the state, or the other side of the country, hidden beneath a piece of land someone has walked over 1,000 times without ever suspecting what lies just below their feet. Either way, the lesson from this discovery is hard to ignore. The past isn't always buried where people expect it to be. Sometimes it's simply waiting quietly, in the dark, underwater, for someone patient enough to go looking.